Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qiju. Coming up in this edition, the US President has met the NATO chief at the White House, focusing on military spending and Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin says the proposed truce between Russia and Ukraine should lead to long-term peace. And Chinese, Russian and Iranian diplomats have discussed the future of Iran's nuclear program. We begin in North America. US President Donald Trump has discussed military spending and the Ukraine peace talks with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. During the meeting at the White House, Trump also brought up his plan to own Greenland. The meeting came amid heightened tensions between the US and the US-led military bloc. Nathan King has details.
Donald Trump's relationship with NATO has never been great. In his first administration, he even toyed of pulling out of the transatlantic alliance, and those doubts have not gone away despite the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, new members coming in during Biden's term, of course, but he has asked people to pay more and he wants them to pay even more, and is still, in private and in public, had question marks about Article 5 and whether he would rush the defence of any NATO member attacked. He said so in the campaign. That continues in his second administration. So with Mark Rutte as well having to deal with the clash between Denmark and the US over the Danish possession of Greenland, he was characteristically diplomatic. But overshadowing, of course, the future of the transatlantic relationship and all the other questions about NATO is the possible ceasefire in Ukraine. Now, obviously, NATO has been supporting Ukraine with weapons, as has the US, but there's a real feeling from the Americans that promises of NATO membership to Ukraine cannot happen. That is a key Russian demand, but also whether NATO countries, UK, France, and others, will be able to deploy troops in the case of any enforcing a ceasefire or deterring any breaking of which. All these questions to be worked out in detail going forward, but the relationship between NATO and, of course, its biggest founding member still very much on the rocks, with many European leaders in private, not in public, working out ways in which to maintain the alliance with less or eventually no American commitment.
That was Nathan King in Washington. Meanwhile, political leaders in Greenland have rejected the US president's latest comments on the potential annexation of the world's largest island. They emphasized the need for unity and a strong stance against external pressure. Chairman Jens Friedrich Nielsen of the Democratic Party and a leading figure in ongoing negotiations to form Greenland's next government called Trump's remarks inappropriate. Incumbent Prime Minister Mutti Eger also denounced Trump's comments, calling for an urgent meeting of Greenland's party leaders. Turning to Europe, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said Moscow is in favor of the United States' ceasefire plan with Ukraine, but nuances remain. He insisted that a proposed truce should lead to long-term peace.
We agree with proposals to end hostilities, but we believe this cessation must be one that leads to long-term peace and addresses the root causes of this crisis.
Putin noted the difficulty in monitoring ceasefire violations along the 2,000-kilometer contact line and raised the issue that Ukraine might use the temporary ceasefire for mobilization and weapons supplies. He also mentioned the Kursk region, where Russian forces have been regaining territory. The Russian president said he might call his U.S. counterpart to discuss the issues. Dasha Chinishova reports.
He has been given his vision of the current proposal for the 30-day ceasefire, saying that Russia in general agrees to the idea of a ceasefire. He was speaking also about the need to precise many of the issues. He said who will be verifying, who will be controlling any possibility of a ceasefire, suggesting that there is a 2,000 kilometers long contact line and it is very difficult to verify those issues. orders if the ceasefire is introduced. He also has said who will be issuing the orders and also wondered what Ukraine will be using these 30 days for. One of the suggestions that the Russian president had was that Ukraine might be using that for the mobilization purposes. So in Russia, it is seen that the ceasefire is indeed a good idea, that Moscow welcomes any negotiated settlement for the Ukraine conflict, but says that a lot more work has to be done. He was also wondering whether Russian troops, who now have the upper hand in the areas in Donbass, should be just letting the Ukrainian troops go. And the same goes for the Kursk region, where he said Moscow does have the upper hand.
That was Stasha Chinsheva in Moscow. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia will not agree to the ceasefire proposal. He accuses Russia of manipulation by setting conditions for reaching the truce.
We have all just heard very predictable and highly manipulative words from Russia in response to the idea of a ceasefire. Russian President Putin is essentially preparing to reject it at this moment. Of course, Putin is afraid to tell US President Donald Trump directly that he wants to continue this war, that he wants to kill Ukrainians.
Meantime, US President Donald Trump has acknowledged good signals from Russia. He says President Putin put out a very promising statement, but it wasn't complete.
Well, we'd like to see a ceasefire from Russia, and we have, not been working in the dark. We've been discussing with Ukraine land and pieces of land that would be kept and lost, and all of the other elements of a final agreement. A lot of the details of a final agreement have actually been discussed. Now we're going to see whether or not Russia's there, and if they're not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world.
Trump also reiterated that he's ready to speak with his Russian counterpart. Also in Europe, French Prime Minister François Bayrou says the EU will not yield to Washington's tariff threats on European wine and champagne. Other EU officials have also urged the US to de-escalate the trade tensions. William Denslow has more in Brussels.
If we glean back at the first Trump term in office and get a sense of just the impact that tariffs did have, of course, we saw the EU taking retaliatory action on US whiskey during this first Trump spat several years ago. Ursula von der Leyen said this week in response to the US steel and aluminium tariffs that tariffs are essentially taxes and they will impact businesses and consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. We've also heard from the European Commission here, and I've been speaking to a Commission spokesperson clarifying Donald Trump's comments for the tariffs to immediately be revoked. He confirmed that these tariffs on whiskey only come into place on April 1st, so there's nothing immediately that the EU can do. The Commission says they are open to negotiate. They say that the steel-in tariff measures were unjustified by Washington. They call for them to be revoked and say they're looking for win-win, not lose-lose cooperation. Now, in the last few hours, I've been speaking to the director of the Spirits Europe, a major trade lobby here in Brussels. They say to me that they urge both sides to stop using the spirits sector as a bargaining chip. They call for this cycle of tit-for-tat measures to end at once.
That was William Denslow reporting from Brussels. Moving on to Asia. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has laid out 5 key points of the country's stance on the Iran nuclear issue. This followed his meeting with the Russian and Iranian vice foreign ministers in Beijing. Wang emphasized resolving disputes through diplomatic means, opposing the use of force and unlawful sanctions. He said Iran should continue to honor its commitment not to develop nuclear weapons, while all parties should respect Iran's legitimate rights under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Wang also called on the US to return to the negotiating table and opposed forced intervention by the UN Security Council. Earlier, Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Ma Zhaoshu hosted his Russian and Iranian counterparts discussing the future of Iran's nuclear program. The trilateral meeting aimed to create the conditions for the resumption of dialogue on Tehran's nuclear program. Iran said earlier it hoped to play an active role in future dialogues. Ehsan Kevani has more in Tehran.
Well, according to Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, Tehran does not have a passive policy at all to sit back and look what decisions other countries, in particular Western countries, make for Iran. In an interview with Iran's state news agency, Abbas Araghchi said that Iran has made planning for possible nuclear negotiations, including those with Europe, adding that Iran will continue negotiations with Europe and consultations with Russia and China. Iran's deputy foreign minister is now in Beijing and has already met with his Chinese counterpart. Before the main meeting, Iran has always emphasized that in its foreign policy and in particular in nuclear issues, it always counts on China and Russia, as both countries are the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council.
That is Ehsan Kavani reporting from Tehran. In the Middle East, Palestinian civil defense teams have been unable to extract the bodies of thousands of people trapped under the rubble due to a lack of resources. This has prompted some families of victims to seek individual solutions to retrieve their loved ones. Alina El-Yazi reports from northern Gaza.
Palestinian Sohail al-Majdalawi lives in the same destroyed house in the northern Gaza Strip that contains the remains of his family who were killed by Israeli bombing. Their bodies are still trapped under the rubble. Sohail has preferred to live under the rubble of his home, digging daily by hand in search of the bodies of his family members, a number of whom he has been able to retrieve.
My family lived here, and the house was completely destroyed. 17 members of my family were killed. I recovered 11 bodies so far, and 6 more remain under the rubble. The bombing happened in December 2023. There are still bodies under this house. I sleep here next to the dead.
Sohail waited for civil defense teams to help him retrieve the bodies of his sons, wife and mother, but help never arrived due to the lack of heavy machinery and equipment.
After a long wait, I was forced to borrow some light equipment from my neighbours. My younger brother and I began breaking up pieces of concrete by hand. I don't know how to explain it, but I had to extract my mother's body in several pieces.
Since the implementation of the truce in January, Palestinians have been searching and attempting to extract thousands of bodies trapped under the rubble, but a lack of resources has prevented this.
We are receiving dozens of calls from citizens asking for help to retrieve bodies from underneath the rubble. This requires heavy equipment and cranes, which we do not have. 90% of our equipment has been destroyed during the conflict.
The Gaza war has resulted in the destruction of tens of thousands of homes and widespread damage to infrastructure throughout Gaza. The Israeli army killed more than 46,000 Palestinians, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza.
That is Elena El-Yazi reporting from Gaza. Finally, in Africa, mysterious viral diseases across the continent have raised questions about the lab safety standards. Most countries have facilities dedicated to virus research, but the same places are often linked to the outbreaks of diseases such as Ebola and Mpox. Isabel Nakira reports from Uganda.
What seems to be a near constant outbreak of new viruses has Africa's scientific community on edge. In the past few years, millions of people have been killed globally from diseases like Ebola, COVID-19 and Mpox. Massive amounts of research are being conducted into where they originated and how they spread. One possibility is that they come from the very labs that are carrying out the research. In Uganda, which is still overcoming an Ebola outbreak, it's a very real problem.
We don't allow bringing 2 different viruses in the lab at the same time, because these may get together, then they may reassort, and probably you come out with an even more virulent disease. So you do the imaging, you start off an emergent disease in the lab.
There are risks everywhere, but most are caused by human error.
It's making sure that the pathogens that you are handling are safe to handle. And it's making sure that there is good monitoring, not just inside, but also outside. So the control measures are absolutely robust.
Different labs have biosecurity guidelines to maintain the highest level of safety standards, and not all labs are licensed to handle dangerous pathogens. The Uganda Virus Research Institute is one of the country's high containment labs studying some of the deadliest pathogens. Scientists here are now working with other labs like the Makerere University lab to strengthen and ensure standards are met.
Supposing any of our staff is not careful enough, he may come out, let's say he didn't put on gloves, he may get infected and come out and infect others. All if we do not autoclave what we have used in the lab. The people normally who are taking these things to the incinerator are not laboratory people.
Fighting near a lab in the eastern DRC has sparked fears over the possibility of an Ebola outbreak. Global concerns over lab safety persist, but researchers here say with strong safety policies, these risks can be minimized.
That was Isabel Nakira reporting. Now, recapping the headlines before we go. The US President has met the NATO chief at the White House, focusing on military spending and Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin says the US proposed truce between Russia and Ukraine should lead to long-term peace. And the Chinese, Russian and Iranian diplomats have discussed the future of Iran's nuclear program in Beijing. That's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We would welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Xi Zhi. Thanks for listening.